Hello everyone and welcome to this second video documenting my project to create a Warhammer 40,000 Imperial Guard force that is more to my liking, designed in my own way, and built entirely from refurbished eBay purchased miniatures. Last episode I used Krita, a digital art application, to brainstorm up some paint schemes that I thought I might want to use for this army, and this time around I'm making up 3 test models in those paint schemes to see which one's going to carry forward for the rest of the army. The first step is to prepare the models, which, given that these are secondhand models, actually involves some different steps from the usual. Most notably, the models I'm using here are going to need to be stripped of their paint job before I move on with applying a new one, just to get things down to, at the very least, the primer, and make sure there's no extra paint clogging up any details as we move forward. To do so, I'm going to plop them into a mixture of warm water and Simple Green, which is a cleaning product I find at a local hardware store. I find that it softens up acrylic paints very well, and then they remove very easily with a toothbrush. So I soak it in there for a few days, I grab a toothbrush, and every day I just take them out and I scrub away at them to get off as much as possible. As I mentioned, primers can stick a little more than everything else, and if there's still a layer of primer left, I don't bother myself too much, but ideally I want to get something like this where the vast majority of the paint is removed. For my future soldier concept, I envisioned not having any garish imperial symbology to, reflect light and such, so I'm just going to go around and sand all of that off as well, cleaning things up with a metal file and some fine grit sandpaper. If you're so inclined, this would be a good time to go through and get some flash and mold lines, but for my 3 test models that are just random infantrymen, I'm not worrying about it. To get smaller details, I'm going to wrap some sandpaper around my angled tweezers here, and by using the tweezers to hold the sandpaper in place, I now have a hard backing that I can use to push against them in small areas, such as the little aquila on this Guardsman's breastplate. I'm also going to go around areas that I know I want to apply Simple Green to and just sand them and buff them so that there's a surface for them to attach to. For the gun barrel, a small drill bit held between the fingers will very easily drill through the plastic and just give us a little bit of a hollow there for a little more authenticity on his shortened las rifle. For the others, I'm going to leave the center in because I guess there's probably a lens or something if it's supposed to be a laser weapon. I'm just going to leave it as is on the lengthened las guns. With the model stripped down to primer and sanded down, I'm now going to move on to just applying some basing material to give a little more detail to the base. My usual combination is cat litter and a little bit of baking soda. The combination of these two makes for a very fine grit sand with some larger pebbles around it that add a little bit of detail and interest to the base. Superglue is my method of choice for attaching it, though white glue works as well. Superglue just firms up very, very quickly because baking soda acts as a bit of a catalyst for it, so it turns it into a workable, paintable surface extremely quickly. This gel superglue is really nice because you can kind of push it around very easily. It keeps its shape, and it'll also keep patterns if you're trying to put patterns into the bases, such as rolling sand dunes, puddles, even cobblestones. I've used superglue to create in the past, if you've looked at some of my Song of Ice and Fire miniatures, with some success. I'm using just a piece of a popsicle stick here that I cut off on a different project to push the glue around into place, make sure it's up against the boots of the miniature on all sides. Then I'm going to go in with a little bit of baking soda on wherever surfaces I don't want larger pebbles to be. That'll seal it up. But if you do want to have pebbles across the entire base, make sure you go to the cat litter first. As I mentioned, the baking soda is a catalyst, and it'll lock the it'll make the superglue set up, basically. So your cat litter pebbles won't set into the superglue if it's already been hit with baking soda. Go cat litter, and then baking soda afterwards. Remember also that cat litter is water soluble, so if you use a really wet white glue or something like that as an alternative to superglue, you may have the stones softening up or crumbling. It's another reason why superglue is kind of my preferred method. Once all of the models have a little bit of a base like that, I'm going to go on to sculpting some new details on. I'm going to use Green Stuff, which is a 2-part epoxy putty. This is the brand I have, blue and yellow Kneadatite. You just knock it out like that, get these 2 little tubes, one's a blue compound, one's a yellow compound. By mixing them together, you get green, and the amount of each that you mix together will change the consistency of it at the end. For my particular batch, I'm not sure if this is true of everything, but if you put more blue in, it'll be a little bit of a harder mix, it'll set up faster. Whereas if you put more yellow in, it'll be softer, and it'll take details a little more, but it'll set up very, very slowly. I went with roughly 50-50 here, but you don't have to be scientific because there is a lot of room to play. Once you've mixed them together and you've got a flat green color, you are ready to work with it. I recommend having a glass of water around for you to be able to rinse your fingers and tools in. It'll stop the green stuff from adhering to you while you're trying to work with it. Some people have recommended sort of a Vaseline or something like that, but I find that it makes everything a little gummy and it's hard to stick extra bits on then if they've already been lubricated with Vaseline. So water is my recommended go-to here. Just remember again, the cat litter is water soluble, so if you did the bases before you do the green stuff like I did, don't get too much water on there. For tools, I have these silicone nibbed tools. They are sort of soft-ended and don't stick, so I get them a little bit wet and I use them to push the green stuff into shape. It's really kind of fun to make things up as you go along with this, really sort of unlock your creativity forward. Here I'm working on the woodland design, which I figured would have sort of a large rucksack, an older school sort of rucksack. It was supposed to be my more familiar of the paint jobs, so more based on what I've seen in real life than anything else. Yeah, just push on whatever you can. I made a little buckle there by just stabbing something on the end of a needle tool. Those are very useful. These silicone tools are also great for making wrinkles and shapes like that. If you look at the bedroll I'm attaching to the top of this rucksack, I'm just going to crease in some little wrinkles where I would imagine there'd be wrap or ties, keeping that on the rucksack, push in the corners, and then with this bullet-headed one, I can go around and take advantage of its sort of wedge shape to make some more natural cloth wrinkles. I'm also going to add some things to belts and bandoliers. In this case, I'm adding what looks like a little demolition charge by pressing in a small screen and using the needle point to just give the impression of buttons for you to press on the actual device. And then some ammunition pouches by squaring them off with my wedge-shaped tool and giving them a little flap for the opening. On my future soldier, I wanted a radio, so I cut a little bit of copper wire, and I just pressed that in with tweezers on top and sculpt a little square shape underneath for a walkie-talkie. For the visor itself, again, I'm pressing a lot of green stuff onto the face of the model, and then I'm going to sort of try to shape it as best as I can and cut things away with the silicone, but really the silicone tool is not well suited to the task of cutting things away, so I just move over to using an X-Acto knife, which is great. It has very flat sides that I can use for pressing out this sort of angular, futuristic concept I had for the visor, and yeah, it has a blade, so it cuts away the green stuff very, very easily while it's setting up. And I just use that to massage it into the shape I want for the visor. After that's all set up, this is what the future soldier looks like at this point. I gave him a knee pad as well, because that seems like a practical thing, a few ammo pouches and a bedroll across the back, and his walkie-talkie on the chest. The others have similar attachments, and the headdresses, all drawn from that brainstorming session I did on Krita in the previous video. To prime these models, I'm going to use Vallejo Surface Primer Black. This is the primer that I always use, applied out of an airbrush to get the thinnest possible coat. It can be applied with a traditional brush as well, if you are so inclined, but do watch out that it's a fairly decent brush and it's not putting too many bubbles in, and you're not applying it too thickly. It does shrink fairly well over top of a miniature and preserve detail, but if you get bubbles into the creases or something like that, you're going to have some weird features in your primer, and it won't stick to the surface as well, which means it's not going to be doing its job as a primer of creating a solid surface for you to paint on. Once the black primer sets up, I'm going to grab some white acrylic paint and apply that through my airbrush from the top of the models to apply a bit of a zenithal highlight. You can do this by dry brushing on white with an actual traditional brush again, but the airbrush is quick and it applies it lightly, so I go with that. By applying the zenithal highlight, I'm helping myself see where the details are so that I can paint and pick out highlighted areas easier later, and it does show through some thinner coats of paint, so it saves you a little bit of work. For those of you who are wondering what my normal workhorse paints and inks are, with the exception of the acrylic paint that's already an airbrush paint that I just showed for the highlighting, pretty much everything I use is these Artist's Loft cheap acrylic paints from Michael's, a local art store, and this Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay ink set, available also at Michael's or online on Amazon. If you do have a Michael's or local art store, I'd recommend going there. They almost always have some sort of cheap paints and inks available. And if it is Michael's, specifically the brand, I know for a fact that they offer coupons very frequently. And a 50% off coupon on the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay ink set makes it basically a steal. So it's definitely worth looking for these things locally if you can find them. Cheap paints mixed up decently and on an okay wet palette can work just as fine as more expensive paints, but you need to mix up your own paints and it's harder to make consistency between models. So it's up to you. For the woodland pattern here, I'm deciding to go with olive green for the armor plates, and I'm going to be going for a sort of bluer, darker green onto the actual camouflage to start with. Each of these coats, I mix up the colors individually on my palette, and I do so by mixing sort of a darkest tone, a mid-tone, and a highlight. I've sort of highlighted this more in previous videos, but I didn't want that to take up so much time in this particular video. So do definitely go see, for example, my recent video on painting Volodyovsky from the Anno Domini 1666 boxed game, if you want an example of how I lay out my palette. Going in here, I am just picking out now, after I've covered everything in the base color, I'm picking out things with the mid-tone, and I'm also putting in a little bit of brown streaks to add to the camouflage. So the trick here is I'm putting in both colors at their darkest, then I'm going to go in with a lighter color and fill in all over top of those, and that'll give me a more full color. You'll have noticed that it didn't apply perfectly. It's a little thin because these are kind of cheap paints, and they're coming off a wet palette, so they're a little wet. But that works fine because as we highlight them up with successive layers of the same color, just highlighted with yellow and white, it's going to both apply more coverage onto the raised areas, the areas we're seeing the most, and it's going to richen that color, liven it up, and provide our highlighting all at the same time. So that works out quite well, and by doing so in alternating bands of green and brown, I get a really basic camouflage on the model's combat uniform, while keeping the actual armor just a flat olive. For the belt attachments, I'm going with a brown, like a weathered leather. Again, dark, mid, and light on those, and black combat boots, because that's just, you know, the classic color for combat boots. I'm also going with a black rifle. I wasn't so happy with how this one turned out, because I found highlighting black to be very difficult to make it still look like black. It was a bit of a, I don't know. It worked out okay by highlighting it with a gray, but for all the metallic bits, I decided to challenge myself and again try to do it sort of a non-metallic way, just to limit the number of paints I'm using here and also to challenge myself and my painting. So I start with a dark gray, then I go in with a lighter gray over top of that and work my way down to bright white highlights over the smallest possible areas. This is true as much of the bayonet as it is of the Aquila on his lasgun and on his canteen, and any other metal bits on, for example, fasteners on his backpack or his ammo pouch on his belt there. Just that dark gray first off, make sure everything's well covered, and this is a dark gray with a little bit of blue because I want the highlights to tend towards blue as if they're reflecting the sky. Then a mid-tone gray just in the upper left quadrant. I just go sort of as if he was being lit from his right shoulder from above, so I try to keep everything, when I look at it from the camera, that's where the light is coming from, and that gives me a reference point that I can paint from, basically. I'm still working on where exactly to lay in highlights on large flat surfaces, like the side of this massive sword they call a bayonet, or, for example, when highlighting the big black rifle. So if you have any tips or any good videos you've seen that have inspired you on how to paint this kind of stuff, let me know. I'm definitely looking to improve my skills. It's been a little bit of a challenge for myself so far going into 2021 to try and paint with less and less specialist paints and just, you know, control paint with my brush and challenge myself a little bit. Certainly I enjoy painting with metallics because they give you a really nice result really quickly, but in terms of my own skills as a traditional painter, there's a little bit of development that I can do for myself by just challenging myself this way. So yeah. For the skin, I used my usual sort of reddish brown up through a pinkish brown up to a beige mixture onto the hands and the face. That one again is detailed in some depth in my video on Volodiyovsky that just came out, so if you are interested in a little more detail, head on over there. I just didn't want to make this video too long by going through the breakdown of my three colors, as I often do. With that, the woodland pattern was complete, and I was feeling pretty good. That one seemed to turn out quite well, although it's a little, you know, safe. It's a very ordinary camouflage pattern. So I wanted to move on here with the urban camo, try something different. This one was going to be a black and gray, just for pure practicality's sake. I figured while I was brainstorming that, you know, I should mix things up a little bit, and I was working from the safest option through to the, I would say, riskiest but most interesting option, which is the last one, the future soldier. Here with the urban camouflage, I really fell kind of flat pretty fast. Black and gray are not high contrast colors. They're not very interesting. There wasn't a lot going on, and I was having a hard time picking them out from each other and making things still look kind of dark and, you know, camouflaged, I guess, that same sort of urban style. Really, it's just, I ran into the problem that on a tabletop, real camouflage and camouflages that might actually work, you know, things that break up the silhouette and hide things from your eye, are exactly the opposite of what you're looking for in a model. On the tabletop, we want our models to be seen, we want them to be obvious, we want it to be clear, we want the shapes to be clear. You know, what weapon is this guy carrying? Whose side is he on? That kind of stuff. So I lost my energy pretty quickly on this one, and I didn't put too much work into it. I also found that the sculpted bits for it, the sort of Mitzneffe style headdress and the smaller, more compact backpack just didn't capture my imagination too much. So for my own part, this urban camouflage project wasn't exactly my favorite, although if some of you out there have painted this sort of gray and black camouflage scheme, certainly let me know. I'm interested to know, if not necessarily for Warhammer 40,000, we'll see how that turns out, then definitely for Battletech, so that I can paint up some more battle mechs for the Grey Death Legion and have it be, visually striking and interesting. Something that gray and black just don't do for me. So finally I've got the Future Soldier, and this one I decided to try and take some extra chances, a little more than usual. I found already the silhouette was really striking. The shortened lasgun really helped immediately to make it seem like some sort of sci-fi elite infantry to me. The radio's great. The visor, I hadn't started playing Cyberpunk 2077 when I designed it, I swear. That was just how I came up with putting on a visor, and I think it looked really good. The model, yeah, I was pretty pleased with how it looked from the front. So I went into it and I decided I'm going to try some weird camouflage colors, not necessarily the kind of stuff that I would normally do, because my camouflage scheme as it was in the brainstorming for the actual combats was a little mixed up. I used a little bit of beige, a little bit of gray, a little whatever. I decided to lean more into that beige and warmer color scheme than the gray multicam that I had maybe envisioned, and went into with a reddish brown as the base color, and a mustard yellow going towards tan for the actual plates. This kind of implies, I guess, a warmer planet color scheme, but I think it would work fine in a lot of semi-arid environments and stuff like that as well. Surely it's the future, they could repaint it if they want, but as far as the tabletop goes, this adds a lot of contrast between the plates and the actual cloth bits. And I thought it looked really striking and interesting, so I was pretty pleased with that. Tan, so like a canvas for all of the actual belt webbing and the sleeping bag, I think made a nice throwback effect, made things look a little more old school than necessarily the rest of the armor looked, which I think was kind of cool. As for the rifle, I painted the main body in that same color as the armor plates, but then I did the attachments and the little rail on top, so the magazine, the rail, the area around the barrel, in gray to just pick them out a little more and make them look more like standard produced maybe. Just mass-produced little plastic magazines that they just discard, or I guess power packs if it's a laser gun. So that was kind of cool. For the visor itself, at first I envisioned some sort of high-contrast orange, like the orange Oakleys that are so popular nowadays for the high visibility, high contrast. Also because I thought something that was actually reflective is kind of the antithesis of tactical. If something's reflecting light back at the enemy, it's pretty hard to hide yourself. But the orange was just not that interesting against the other warm colors on the model. So I decided instead to go for an almost Windows XP desktop background, blue and green reflection of sort of hillsides. It doesn't necessarily match up. Again, it's kind of arid armor, and the idea of a reflective visor is not very tactical, but the contrast in colors I think looks really, really good, so I liked it quite a lot. I did it by laying in basically a base of blue and a base of green below. Green going into brown, basically, for the earthy area, with a very distinct sort of separating line of very, very pale blue at the horizon to try and paint it in like a landscape with the sun sort of lightest down near the ground and darker up near the edges. It was a little hard to do around the edges of the visor. Some of it just looks like it's supposed to be edge reflection on the visor itself rather than being actual reflection of landscape, but I think the end result was fantastic. And before you ask, yeah, my camera wasn't recording when I finished it off, I'm sorry, so I'm just going to explain it quickly here. You can see the blue above, the green below. The green goes from light at the bottom to dark near the horizon line, and then I do the same with the sky, starting at light near the horizon line, going up to dark at the top of the visor. I've got a little bit of a reflection in the corner that could be the sun sort of catching in the lightest part of the sky, and by making things alternate from light to dark to light to dark, I've got these very distinct bands of color that make the reflection actually look quite good from a distance. Even though if you look at it from a distance, it kind of just looks like he's got a bluish visor, maybe. But I know it's a landscape, I know it's a reflection, and I'm very happy with how it turned out. The camouflage itself was just finished off with stripes of light gray banded with dark gray over top of that reddish pink sort of warm base. Finishing off the models, my methodology was pretty much the same as you'll have seen in previous videos if you do follow the channel at all. I start off with a little bit of Mod Podge. This is Mod Podge Gloss, actually, but it doesn't matter too much. It still dries clear like Mod Podge Matte. It'll just have a glossy finish that'll be beaten down by applying the matte varnish afterwards anyway. I just ran out of Mod Podge Matte. So Mod Podge Gloss applied in little blobs where I want the grass to stick. I went with sort of a scattered grass look here, not the entire thing able to catch grass, but just little patches, making sure to leave some of the stones visible because those are nice details for the base, and trying to leave some of the brownish base visible because if he's going to have a sort of tan camouflage, then I guess his planet shouldn't be a beautiful prairie or a, steppe land or something like that with the long grass everywhere. For the actual weathering here, I don't normally weather that much, and I decided to go very light here as well. I just grabbed the corner of a torn-off sponge, put a very, very little bit of brown paint on it, and applied it across the bottom edge of the armor plates and the gaiters and boots in particular, just because I thought it broke up sort of the large flat areas of uniform color pretty nicely afterwards. The end of the gun barrel was also touched this way with a little bit of gray to make it look like the gun had been worn down from firing. After that was done, I go in with just a little bit of black flow acrylic. Flow acrylic is just a black acrylic that has a lot of its medium in it versus its pigment, which means it flows very well. It's basically pre-watered down. Sometimes it takes 2 coats on the edge of a base, but the advantage of the flow acrylic is that it does settle out into a really smooth layer, and it just looks kind of nice at the end after everything's been hit with a matte varnish to add this semi-gloss brim to my models, I find anyway. It's also very easy to touch up if it does get chipped because it went on after the varnish because it's a very cheap paint. So that's a big plus. And that's it. Finally, we've gotten to the end of these 3 test models. I've taken out all of the 3 paint schemes that came from my brainstorming session that I featured in the previous episode, and I have turned them into miniatures to test them out and see which one of them would be the winner for the upcoming army. If you saw last video, I've got quite a lot of Warhammer models that I got off eBay, considerably cheaper than manufacturer's price that I'm going to refurbish into this particular new army of mine, with the goal of making a Warhammer army that doesn't necessarily feel too Warhammer, because I'm not a huge 40k fan if I'm being honest, but it is a very popular game. The rules are decent enough, and it being popular means that if I'm actually looking to game with people once the pandemic's coming up, having a Warhammer army certainly can't hurt. So here I am making a Warhammer 40,000 Astra Militarum army that I'm hoping to be able to use for other generic sci-fi as well. With all of that background in mind, and with these 3 test models finished, I'm now at a decision point. Which of these 3 schemes do I like the most, and which of them would I like to carry on with painting across an entire army of Warhammer 40,000 models? I think you've noticed by now, but the urban one didn't really win any favors from me, so unless anybody's got some real big inspiration on how to paint with gray and black or some similar urban scheme in an interesting way, I think that one's a write-off. The headdress had some potential, but it's... compared to the other 2, it's just not that interesting. I'm definitely going to go with the helmet scrim or the visor. But as for the rest of the design, I am still very interested to hear what you all have to say. I do have quite a lot of these to paint, and they're not all the normal Cadians either. I think there's some other varieties of Imperial Guard in there, so if there are any weird suggestions that come out of the comments that catch my eye, I'd be happy probably to experiment with them on some, specialist weapon teams or something like that as I'm going forward. If you have any Warhammer 40,000 related suggestions as well, this is more rules side or, force composition side. I've already bought the models, but I've got some bits bags that came with them, so, if there's a certain weapon I should be including in every particular squad, it would be good to know, so that while I'm refurbishing these models, I can, hack off old weapons, put on new ones, and figure out some new redesigns for some of those weapons if I am going to look for short-barreled or more tactical versions of things. Anyway, before I go on gabbing too much longer, thank you all very much for watching, and as usual, go play some games.